Ever heard of a punishment so horrific that even hardened criminals would beg for a quick beheading instead? Well, buckle up, because we're diving into one of the most twisted execution methods in human history. Ancient Persia had a little something called Scaphism. And, trust me, after you hear what it involves, you'll never complain about a parking ticket again. Picture this. You're a soldier in 401 BC, and you've just done something incredibly stupid. You've bragged about killing a prince at a royal banquet. The wine was flowing, you felt invincible, and your tongue got a little too loose. Now you're about to discover why the Persian Empire struck fear into the hearts of everyone from Egypt to India. Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well. What we're about to explore isn't just some medieval horror story cooked up by Hollywood. This is documented history from the court of Artaxerxes II, one of the most powerful rulers who ever lived. We're talking about an empire that stretched across 3 continents, controlled the world's most important trade routes, and had execution methods that would make modern dictators take notes. But here's where it gets really interesting. The only reason we know about Scaphism today is because of a Greek physician named Ctesias, who had unprecedented access to the Persian royal court. This guy was basically the ancient equivalent of a war correspondent embedded with the enemy, except instead of reporting on battles, he was documenting torture techniques that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Now, I know what you're thinking. Another gruesome historical punishment. Right? Wrong. What makes Scaphism absolutely terrifying isn't just the method itself, but the calculated precision behind it. This wasn't some barbaric impulse or moment of rage. This was engineered suffering, designed by people who understood exactly how to keep someone alive while systematically destroying them from the inside out. The Persian Empire of the 4th century BC wasn't some chaotic wasteland ruled by bloodthirsty savages. These were the people who built the world's first postal system, created magnificent gardens that inspired legends, and established legal codes that influenced civilizations for centuries. They were sophisticated, cultured, and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting their power. So how did a civilization capable of such incredible achievements also perfect one of history's most sadistic execution methods? That's the question that's going to keep you watching, because the answer reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature and the lengths people will go to maintain control. Let me set the stage for you. The year is 404 BC, and Artaxerxes II has just become the most powerful man on Earth. He's inherited an empire that makes modern superpowers look like neighborhood watch groups. We're talking about territories that stretched from modern-day Turkey to Pakistan, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf. This guy controlled more wealth than most countries see in a century. But here's the thing about absolute power. Everybody wants it, especially your own family. Artaxerxes had barely warmed the throne when his younger brother Cyrus decided he deserved to be king instead. Not exactly the kind of sibling rivalry you can solve with a family meeting and some group therapy. Cyrus wasn't messing around either. This wasn't some palace coup attempt with a handful of guards. He assembled a massive army, complete with 10,000 Greek mercenaries who were basically the Navy SEALs of the ancient world. These weren't farmers with pitchforks. These were professional killers who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of warfare. The stage was set for one of the most consequential battles in ancient history. 2 brothers, both convinced they were destined to rule the known world, leading armies that could have conquered most other nations by themselves. The Battle of Cunaxa was going to determine not just who wore the crown, but the entire future of human civilization. Now, battles in ancient times weren't like the organized warfare we see today. There were no GPS coordinates, no satellite intelligence, no radio communications. These were massive, chaotic melees where visibility was limited to whatever you could see through the dust and blood, and survival often came down to pure luck as much as skill. The morning of September 3rd, 401 BC, changed everything. Cyrus and his Greek mercenaries were actually winning. The kid had outmaneuvered his older brother, and it looked like the Persian Empire was about to get a new ruler. Artaxerxes was probably already composing his surrender speech when fate intervened in the most dramatic way possible. A single javelin, thrown by an ordinary soldier named Mithridates, struck Cyrus in the temple and knocked him from his horse. Just like that, the entire course of world history pivoted on one perfectly aimed throw by a guy whose name would have been forgotten if he hadn't made the worst mistake of his life afterward. Here's where things get really interesting. Artaxerxes knew that his victory was a fluke. One lucky throw had saved his empire. But everyone knew it wasn't his skill or strategy that won the day. A king whose authority came from divine mandate couldn't afford to look like he owed his throne to random chance and a common soldier's lucky shot. So Artaxerxes did what any paranoid dictator would do. He rewrote history. He bribed Mithridates to keep quiet about who really killed Cyrus, showered him with gold and honors, and made sure everyone believed the king himself had personally struck down his rebellious brother. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Because Mithridates made the kind of mistake that gets people killed in the most horrible ways imaginable. He got drunk at a royal banquet and started bragging about his moment of glory in front of witnesses, including people who reported directly to Queen Mother Parysatis, who had her own very specific ideas about how traitors should be dealt with. Now, Queen Mother Parysatis deserves her own horror movie. This woman had watched her two sons tear each other apart, had seen her younger son killed in battle, and was looking for someone to blame. When she heard that some nobody soldier was taking credit for ending her favorite child's life, well, let's just say she didn't handle it with the grace and forgiveness you might expect from royalty. Parysatis had access to the royal executioners, people who had spent their entire careers perfecting methods of inflicting maximum suffering while keeping their victims alive as long as possible. These weren't amateur torturers learning on the job. These were specialists who understood human anatomy, psychology, and endurance better than most doctors, which brings us back to Scaphism and why this particular punishment was chosen for Mithridates. See, the Persian justice system wasn't just about killing people who crossed the crown, it was about sending a message that would echo through the empire for generations. They needed something so horrific that even hearing about it secondhand would make people think twice before betraying their oaths. The method itself was diabolically simple, which made it even more terrifying. 2 boats, carefully modified with holes just the right size. A victim stripped naked and positioned so only their head, hands, and feet protruded outside. Then comes the part that makes your skin crawl. They would force-feed the prisoner a mixture of milk and honey until they were sick, then smear the same mixture all over their exposed body parts. But that was just the beginning. The real horror of Scaphism wasn't the confinement or even the forced feeding. It was what happened next. The milk and honey attracted every flying insect within miles. Flies, wasps, bees, anything with wings, and a desire for sweetness would descend on the helpless victim like a living cloud of torment. Meanwhile, the daily force-feeding continued. The victim couldn't die of dehydration or starvation because their executioners made sure they stayed nourished. But all that milk and honey had to go somewhere, and with nowhere else to go, it created the perfect breeding ground for maggots and other creatures that would slowly begin consuming the victim from the inside out. The genius of this method, if you can call it that, was its sustainability. A quick execution might satisfy immediate justice, but it's over in minutes. Scaphism could last for weeks, with the victim remaining conscious and aware for most of that time. Every day brought new horrors, new levels of suffering, and the absolute certainty that there was no escape and no mercy coming. According to our sources, Mithridates endured 17 days of this treatment before finally succumbing. 17 days of being eaten alive by insects while trapped in his own waste, knowing that his moment of drunken boasting had cost him everything. 17 days for word to spread throughout the empire about what happened to people who crossed the royal family. But here's what makes this story even more chilling. Scaphism wasn't some heat-of-the-moment revenge. It was an established punishment in the Persian legal system, complete with trained executioners who knew exactly how to maximize suffering while preventing premature death. This was institutionalized torture, refined over generations and perfected through practice. The Persian Empire didn't just happen to invent one horrific execution method. They had an entire catalogue of creative ways to kill people, each designed for specific types of crimes and intended audiences. Impaling for rebels, flaying for thieves, dismemberment for road bandits. They had turned human suffering into a science, with Scaphism representing the absolute pinnacle of their expertise. What's truly disturbing is how this fits into the broader context of Persian civilization. These same people created beautiful art, established libraries, built magnificent cities, and developed philosophical traditions that influenced human thought for centuries. The capacity for such refined cruelty existed alongside genuine cultural achievements that we still admire today. This raises uncomfortable questions about human nature itself. How do you reconcile a civilization capable of creating the Hanging Gardens of Babylon with one that could systematically torture people to death over the course of weeks? Were the Persians uniquely cruel, or does every society contain the seeds of such brutality, waiting for the right circumstances to bloom? The answer might be more disturbing than the torture methods themselves, because it suggests that the line between civilization and barbarism is much thinner than we'd like to believe. The most unsettling part about studying ancient Persian punishment isn't just the methods themselves, but how they reveal the sophisticated psychology behind maintaining absolute power. See, modern dictators rely on secret police, surveillance technology, and mass media to control their populations. The Persians had none of that. What they had was something far more effective: the power of imagination. Think about it this way. In our connected world, horrible news travels fast, but it also gets buried under the next crisis within hours. Back in 400 BC, a story like Mithridates would spread slowly, mouth to mouth, growing more vivid and terrifying with each telling. By the time it reached the farthest corners of the empire, months later, it had become legend. A cautionary tale that parents would whisper to their children about what happens when you challenge the gods. And make no mistake, that's exactly how the Persian kings wanted to be seen. Not as men, but as divine beings whose authority came directly from Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of their religion. Questioning the king wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy. And blasphemy deserved punishment that would make even the gods take notice. This is where Queen Mother Parysatis becomes absolutely crucial to understanding how Scaphism fit into Persian court politics. She wasn't just some grieving mother seeking revenge for her dead son. She was a master manipulator who understood that public executions were political theatre, and the more spectacular the show, the more effective the message. Parysatis had spent decades navigating the deadly waters of royal succession. She'd watched sons kill fathers, brothers murder brothers, and wives poison husbands, all in the name of securing the throne. She knew that mercy was often interpreted as weakness, and weakness in a royal family was a death sentence for everyone involved. When she decided Mithridates needed to die, she wasn't just punishing one drunk soldier. She was sending a message to every general, every satrap, every minor noble throughout the empire. The royal family remembers everything, and their revenge will be more creative than your worst nightmares. But here's what makes Parysatis particularly fascinating. Historical accounts describe her as incredibly intelligent, cultured, and even charming when it served her purposes. She wasn't some bloodthirsty monster foaming at the mouth. She was a calculated predator who could discuss philosophy over dinner and then order someone flayed alive before dessert. This split personality wasn't unusual among Persian royalty. They were raised from birth to see themselves as fundamentally different from ordinary humans. Regular people felt pain, fear, and moral constraints. Kings and queens were above such limitations. They were living gods who couldn't afford to show weakness or compassion to their enemies. The training started early. Royal children were taught that their subjects were essentially livestock to be managed, not fellow humans deserving of empathy. They learned that a king who hesitated to inflict necessary punishment would soon find himself replaced by someone more decisive. Mercy was a luxury they literally couldn't afford. This mindset explains how someone like Artaxerxes could order mass executions in the morning and then spend the afternoon composing poetry or discussing astronomy with court scholars. These weren't contradictions in his personality. They were different aspects of the same divine authority that allowed him to create and destroy with equal ease. The Persian concept of royal justice was built on the idea that the king's will was literally the will of heaven. When Artaxerxes condemned someone to Scaphism, he wasn't making a personal decision, he was channeling divine judgment through his earthly authority. The victim wasn't being tortured by a man, but by the gods themselves, using the king as their instrument. This religious dimension made Persian punishments even more psychologically devastating. Victims couldn't even comfort themselves with thoughts of eventual revenge or justice in an afterlife. According to Persian theology, their suffering was divinely ordained, meaning it would continue even after death unless the king chose to show mercy, and mercy was rare. The Persian royal archives, which unfortunately haven't survived to modern times, apparently contain detailed records of every punishment inflicted by royal decree. These weren't just legal documents, they were instructional manuals for future rulers, showing exactly what methods worked best for different types of crimes and different audiences. Scaphism was reserved for the most serious offences against royal dignity. Simple treason might earn you a quick beheading or a relatively swift impaling, but claiming credit for royal kills, insulting the king's divine nature, or threatening the succession required something more memorable. The process began long before the actual execution. First came the public announcement of the sentence, read in marketplaces and posted on temple doors throughout the relevant provinces. This wasn't just legal notification. It was psychological warfare, designed to make every listener imagine themselves in the condemned person's position. Then came the preparation phase, which could last for days. The execution boats had to be specially constructed or modified. The milk and honey mixture required specific proportions to achieve maximum insect attraction without killing the victim too quickly through allergic reactions or choking. The executioners themselves underwent extensive training. These weren't random guards assigned to torture duty. They were specialists who understood human physiology well enough to keep someone alive and conscious for weeks under the most horrific conditions imaginable. They knew exactly how much food and water to provide, which injuries to treat and which to ignore, and how to prevent premature death from shock or organ failure. During the actual execution, crowds would gather to witness the spectacle, but this wasn't mindless bloodlust from primitive people. These were educated citizens of the most advanced civilization on Earth, and their presence served multiple political purposes. First, it provided witnesses who could spread accurate accounts of what happened to anyone foolish enough to challenge royal authority. Second, it demonstrated the king's absolute power over life and death, reinforcing the divine nature of his rule. Third, it gave ordinary people a chance to participate in royal justice, making them complicit in the system that oppressed them. The psychological impact on witnesses was carefully calculated. They would see someone who had committed the ultimate crime against royal dignity reduced to a writhing, screaming animal over the course of weeks. They would watch as the victim's mind gradually disintegrated under constant torment, leaving only a shell of humanity clinging to life through pure biological stubbornness. But perhaps most importantly, they would understand that this fate awaited anyone who forgot their proper place in the cosmic order that placed the king at the apex of all creation. The documentation we have suggests that successful Scaphism executions became legendary throughout the Persian Empire and beyond. Ambassadors from other kingdoms would return home with vivid descriptions of Persian justice, spreading fear of Artaxerxes far beyond his actual borders. Enemy armies would sometimes surrender rather than risk capture and potential Scaphism if they were found guilty of crimes against Persian dignity. This reputation for creative cruelty became one of Persia's most effective diplomatic tools. Why waste resources conquering a city when the mere threat of Persian punishment methods could achieve the same result? The empire expanded not just through military might, but through carefully cultivated terror that made resistance seem pointless. Yet here's the truly chilling part. Most Persian subjects probably never witnessed Scaphism personally. The vast majority of people in the empire lived their entire lives without seeing anything more violent than a simple beheading or flogging. The power of Scaphism came not from its frequent use, but from its legendary status as the ultimate punishment that could theoretically befall anyone who stepped too far out of line. This created a psychological atmosphere where people policed themselves far more effectively than any secret police force could manage. Everyone knew someone who claimed to know someone who had witnessed Scaphism. Everyone had heard the stories, embellished through countless retellings, until they took on mythical proportions. The genius of this system was its efficiency. A single horrific execution like Mithridates could maintain social order across millions of people for decades. The story would be passed down through generations, becoming more terrifying with each telling, until even great-grandchildren of the original witnesses would modify their behavior based on events they never saw. But this psychological control system came with its own dangers, which the Persian rulers were about to discover in ways that would ultimately destroy their empire forever. The problem with ruling through terror is that it only works as long as people believe you're invincible, and by the middle of the 4th century BC, cracks were starting to show in the Persian Empire's carefully maintained facade of divine authority. The same psychological weapons that had kept rebellions in check for generations were beginning to backfire in spectacular ways. See, there's a fundamental flaw in any system built on fear. It requires constant escalation to maintain effectiveness. What terrifies one generation becomes just another cautionary tale to the next. Stories that once sent grown men running for cover start sounding like ancient history to kids who've never seen the real thing. The Persian kings found themselves trapped in an arms race against their own reputation. This is where things get really interesting from a historical perspective. The generation that came of age after Artaxerxes had been on the throne for 20 years didn't remember the chaos of civil war or the desperate uncertainty that had made Scaphism seem necessary. To them, the king was just another old man making threats about punishments that sounded more like mythology than reality. Young nobles started pushing boundaries that their parents would never have dared approach. Provincial governors began skimming more tribute than ever before, figuring the king was too old and distant to notice. Military commanders started wondering if their armies might be more loyal to them personally than to some distant throne in Persepolis. The Persian intelligence network, which had once been the envy of the ancient world, started reporting disturbing trends from across the empire. Jokes about the royal family were spreading through markets and taverns. Satirical songs that would have earned their composers a date with the execution boats were now being sung openly in the streets. Most alarming of all, people were starting to ask questions about whether the kings were really divine or just particularly successful warlords with good public relations. Artaxerxes tried to respond the only way he knew how, with more spectacular punishments. But here's the thing about escalation in a world without modern media. Each new atrocity had to be more elaborate than the last to generate the same level of fear, and eventually you run out of ways to make death more horrible than it already is. The king's executioners became victims of their own success. They had perfected Scaphism to the point where everyone knew exactly what it entailed, which meant it had lost its power to terrify through mystery and imagination. When people can visualize exactly what's going to happen to them, they can mentally prepare for it. And once you can mentally prepare for the worst possible punishment, it stops controlling your behavior. This created a vicious cycle that would plague the Persian Empire for the rest of its existence. Each failed attempt to reassert control through terror made the crown look weaker and more desperate. Each public execution that failed to generate the expected level of submission encouraged more people to test the limits of royal patience. The situation was made worse by the fact that Artaxerxes was getting old, and everyone knew it. Succession crises were inevitable in Persian politics, and ambitious nobles were already positioning themselves for the chaos that would follow the king's death. Why risk everything to stay loyal to a dying monarch when you could start building relationships with potential successors? But the real nail in the coffin for Persian terror-based governance came from an unexpected source: the very Greek mercenaries who had fought for Cyrus at Cunaxa. The survivors of that battle had made their way home with detailed first-hand accounts of Persian military tactics, political organization, and yes, punishment methods. What had once been mysterious and terrifying became familiar and manageable once people understood the mechanisms behind it. Greek writers started producing detailed accounts of Persian court life that demystified the whole system. Suddenly, the Persian kings weren't unknowable gods dispensing divine justice. They were just men with unusually creative torture devices. This knowledge spread throughout the Mediterranean world like wildfire. City-states that had once trembled at the mention of Persian displeasure started calculating whether they could actually resist imperial demands. Military commanders began developing specific tactics for fighting Persian armies based on inside information about their strengths and weaknesses. The psychological warfare that had been Persia's secret weapon became a liability when everyone understood how it worked. It's like knowing how a magic trick is performed. Once you see the wires and mirrors, the illusion loses all its power to amaze or frighten you. Meanwhile, back in the Persian heartland, Artaxerxes was facing a problem that no amount of creative execution could solve. The empire had grown too large and complex to govern through personal terror. The king simply couldn't be everywhere at once, and his representatives in distant provinces were starting to act like independent rulers rather than loyal administrators. This is where the Persian system's reliance on absolute royal authority became a fatal weakness. Everything depended on the king's personal involvement and divine approval. Unlike later empires that developed bureaucratic institutions capable of functioning independently, Persia never created systems that could operate effectively without direct royal supervision. The result was a cascade of administrative failures that made the empire increasingly ungovernable. Tax collection became spotty and unreliable. Military units began refusing orders that didn't come directly from the king himself. Trade routes that had been secure for generations started experiencing unprecedented levels of banditry and disruption. Each problem required the king's personal attention to resolve, but there were far too many problems for one man to handle, no matter how divine his authority supposedly was. Artaxerxes found himself constantly traveling from crisis to crisis, trying to maintain personal control over an empire that had outgrown any individual's capacity to manage. This created opportunities for exactly the kind of ambitious rivals that Scaphism was supposed to deter. When the king was busy putting down a rebellion in one province, nobles in other regions could consolidate power without immediate fear of retribution. By the time royal attention turned their way, they had often become too powerful to eliminate safely. The Persian Empire entered what historians now recognize as a death spiral, where each attempt to reassert central control created new problems that required even more direct intervention. The kings became prisoners of their own success, trapped by the very territories they had conquered and unable to delegate authority without risking rebellion. But perhaps the most ironic twist in this story is how Scaphism itself contributed to the empire's downfall. The method was so resource-intensive and time-consuming that it became impractical for dealing with large-scale opposition. You can execute 1 or 2 people per year using boats and honey, but what do you do when entire provinces start questioning your authority? The Persian kings never developed efficient methods of mass execution because they had been so focused on creating maximum psychological impact through elaborate individual punishments. When they finally faced widespread resistance, they discovered that their most terrifying weapons were completely useless against large numbers of opponents. This forced them to rely increasingly on conventional military solutions, which meant treating rebels as enemy soldiers rather than treasonous subjects. But once you start fighting wars against your own people instead of executing criminals, you've already admitted that your divine authority has limits. The final blow came when Persian military commanders started realizing that they were more afraid of their own king than they were of foreign enemies. Defeat in battle might mean death, but failure to satisfy royal expectations could mean Scaphism. This created a perverse incentive structure where generals would rather avoid military engagement entirely than risk the kind of spectacular failure that might attract unwanted royal attention. As a result, Persian armies became increasingly defensive and risk-averse at exactly the moment when the empire needed bold, aggressive leadership to deal with emerging threats. Commanders who should have been focusing on military strategy spent their energy on political survival, making sure they had enough court connections to avoid blame if things went wrong. The empire that had once conquered half the known world through audacious military campaigns became paralyzed by its own success. The very punishments that had made resistance seem hopeless had also made competent leadership nearly impossible. By the time Alexander the Great arrived on the scene, he wasn't facing the terrifying Persian war machine that had dominated world politics for 2 centuries. He was confronting a hollowed-out empire held together by fear, tradition, and bureaucratic inertia, ruled by kings who had become prisoners of their own reputation for cruelty. The irony is perfect and devastating. The empire that had perfected the art of psychological warfare through torture ultimately destroyed itself by becoming too psychologically dependent on terror to function as an actual government. Scaphism had become both symbol and cause of Persian decline, representing everything that was sophisticated and everything that was wrong with their approach to power. And this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing lesson from the whole bloody saga. Sometimes the most effective short-term solutions become the most destructive long-term problems, especially when they involve treating human beings as objects rather than people. The most chilling aspect of studying Artaxerxes and his use of Scaphism isn't what it tells us about ancient Persia, but what it reveals about power structures that still exist today. Because here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to acknowledge. The psychological mechanisms that made Scaphism effective didn't disappear when the Persian Empire fell. They just evolved. Modern authoritarian regimes don't need boats and honey to control their populations. They have surveillance technology, social media manipulation, and economic pressure that can destroy lives just as thoroughly as any ancient torture device. The principle remains exactly the same. Make an example of a few people in such a spectacular way that millions of others modify their behavior to avoid the same fate. But there's something uniquely horrifying about Scaphism that goes beyond its physical brutality. It represents the ultimate corruption of nurturing into torture. Milk and honey, substances associated with life, growth, and sweetness, become instruments of prolonged agony. It's like taking everything good about human civilization and inverting it into its opposite. This inversion wasn't accidental. Persian executioners understood that the most effective psychological warfare attacks people's basic assumptions about safety and comfort. If milk and honey can become torture devices, then nothing is truly safe. If boats, symbols of escape and journey, can become prisons, then there's nowhere to run. The genius behind this approach was recognizing that humans need predictability to function. We create mental categories: good things, bad things, safe spaces, dangerous places. Scaphism deliberately scrambled these categories, making it impossible for potential victims to feel secure even in apparently benign situations. Think about how this would affect someone living in the Persian Empire. Every time you saw boats on a river, you'd remember Mithridates. Every time you tasted honey, you'd think about what it could become. Every time you attended a banquet, you'd remember that loose tongues led to unspeakable consequences. The execution didn't just kill one man, it poisoned the everyday experiences of millions. This contamination of normal life was precisely the point. The Persian kings weren't trying to eliminate opposition through direct violence alone. They were creating a psychological environment where opposition couldn't even form because people were too busy monitoring their own thoughts and actions for potential disloyalty. But here's where the Persian system made a crucial miscalculation that would echo through history. They assumed that fear would always be stronger than curiosity, that terror would always trump human nature's tendency to push boundaries and test limits. They forgot that humans are remarkably adaptable creatures who eventually become accustomed to even the most extreme circumstances. The generation that grew up hearing stories about Mithridates developed different risk calculations than their parents. They had never lived in a world without the threat of Scaphism, so it became background noise rather than active deterrent. It's like how people living near airports eventually stop noticing airplane sounds, or how residents of earthquake zones learn to function despite constant seismic risk. This adaptation process accelerated when people realized that Scaphism, for all its horror, was actually quite rare. The Persian Empire had millions of subjects, and only a handful ever experienced the boats. Once people started doing the math, they realized their chances of dying from disease, accident, or conventional warfare were thousands of times higher than their risk of facing royal torture. The Persian monarchy had created a system that was simultaneously too extreme and not extreme enough. Too extreme because it generated resentment and resistance that conventional punishment might have avoided. Not extreme enough because it couldn't actually be applied to large numbers of people, which meant most potential rebels never faced personal consequences for their actions. This mathematical reality became clear during the Great Satrap's Revolt that plagued Artaxerxes' later years. When entire provinces rebelled simultaneously, the royal executioners became irrelevant. You can't Scaphism your way out of a civil war involving thousands of armed soldiers. The most sophisticated torture methods in history proved completely useless against organized military resistance. The rebels understood this calculation better than the king did. They knew that once they committed to open revolt, individual punishment became impossible. Artaxerxes could potentially capture and execute a few ringleaders, but he couldn't torture entire armies. The scale of resistance made his most feared weapons obsolete. This created a fascinating psychological reversal. The same fear that had once paralyzed potential opponents now paralyzed the king himself. Artaxerxes knew that conventional military action against the rebels would be seen as an admission that his divine authority had limits. But he also knew that Scaphism was useless against organized opposition. The result was a kind of strategic paralysis where neither side could act decisively. The rebels couldn't risk individual exposure to royal justice, but they also couldn't achieve decisive military victory. The king couldn't admit his limitations by treating rebels as legitimate military opponents, but he also couldn't eliminate them through his traditional methods. Meanwhile, the empire's administrative structure continued deteriorating as resources were diverted to fight internal wars that nobody could win decisively. Trade networks collapsed, tax collection became sporadic, and provincial governors started acting like independent rulers because they had no choice but to fill the power vacuum. The Persian Empire became trapped in what modern game theorists would recognize as a destructive equilibrium, where all parties were making rational decisions based on their individual constraints, but the collective result was catastrophic for everyone involved. The system that had once seemed brilliantly designed for maintaining control had become a machine for generating chaos. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this breakdown was how it affected ordinary Persian citizens who had no involvement in high politics whatsoever. They found themselves caught between rebel armies, royal forces, and increasingly desperate provincial administrators who were all competing for the same limited resources. For common people trying to farm, trade, or raise families, the empire's internal conflicts meant constant uncertainty about which authority to obey, which taxes to pay, and which laws to follow. The psychological warfare that had once targeted potential rebels now terrorized everyone, because nobody could be sure which side would control their region next week. This uncertainty created exactly the opposite of what Persian royal policy had intended. Instead of a docile population afraid to challenge authority, the empire developed a cynical, opportunistic culture where people learned to switch loyalties based on immediate survival needs rather than genuine allegiance to any particular ruler. The breakdown of trust between rulers and subjects became self-reinforcing. Kings who suspected their people of disloyalty implemented harsher punishments, which generated actual disloyalty, which justified even harsher measures. The population learned to view all authority as potentially dangerous and temporary, which made them unreliable allies for anyone trying to establish stable governance. By the time Alexander the Great began his conquest of the Persian Empire, he wasn't facing a unified enemy led by a divine king commanding absolute loyalty. He was confronting a collection of competing factions, each more afraid of their own allies than they were of foreign invasion. Many Persian subjects actually welcomed Alexander as a liberator, not because they loved Greek culture, but because they hoped a new ruler might be less arbitrary and cruel than the system they knew. The psychological warfare that had once been Persia's greatest strength had become its fatal weakness. The fall of the Persian Empire represents one of history's clearest examples of how short-term tactical success can create long-term strategic disaster. Scaphism worked perfectly for its immediate purpose of eliminating specific threats and deterring others. But its broader effects on Persian political culture made the empire increasingly ungovernable and ultimately defenseless. This pattern has repeated throughout history whenever governments rely primarily on fear rather than legitimacy to maintain power. The initial results are often impressive, as opposition melts away and compliance increases dramatically, but the long-term costs in terms of administrative efficiency, military effectiveness, and social cohesion almost always exceed the short-term benefits. Modern political scientists studying authoritarian regimes have identified this as the dictator's dilemma. The same methods that help you seize and consolidate power make it nearly impossible to govern effectively once you have it. Fear-based systems create risk-averse bureaucracies, unreliable intelligence networks, and populations that prioritize survival over productivity. The Persian example is particularly instructive because it shows how this process plays out over multiple generations. Artaxerxes probably never imagined that his use of Scaphism would contribute to his empire's eventual destruction. From his perspective, he was simply using the most effective tools available to maintain order and project strength. But political systems are complex, adaptive networks where small changes can have enormous long-term consequences. The decision to execute Mithridates using Scaphism rather than conventional methods sent ripples throughout Persian society that ultimately changed the entire character of the empire. This is why studying ancient history isn't just academic curiosity. The psychological and political dynamics that destroyed the Persian Empire are still operating today, in different forms but with remarkably similar results. Understanding how fear-based governance systems collapse can help us recognize similar patterns in our own time. The story of Scaphism and the Persian Empire offers a sobering reminder that even the most sophisticated and successful civilizations can be undone by their own methods of maintaining control. Power built on terror may seem invincible in the short term, but it contains the seeds of its own destruction, and perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates that treating human beings as objects to be manipulated rather than people deserving of dignity isn't just morally wrong, it's ultimately self-defeating, even from a purely practical standpoint. The boats that held Mithridates became symbols of everything that was both magnificent and monstrous about the Persian Empire. They represented the incredible sophistication of a civilization that could engineer suffering with scientific precision, and the fundamental blindness that prevented its rulers from seeing how their own methods were destroying the system they were trying to protect. The legacy of these Persian torture methods didn't end with Alexander's conquest. What happened next reveals something even more disturbing about how cruelty spreads through history like a virus, infecting civilizations that should have known better. When Alexander's generals carved up the Persian Empire among themselves, they kept more than just the territory and treasure. They adopted the administrative systems, the court ceremonies, and yes, the execution methods that had made Persian rule so effective. The boats and honey didn't disappear with Artaxerxes. They evolved. The Seleucid Empire, which controlled most of the former Persian territories, maintained detailed records of judicial punishments that survived until the Roman conquest. These documents, discovered by archaeologists in the 20th century, reveal that Scaphism continued to be used for nearly 300 years after the Persian Empire fell. The new rulers had simply rebranded it as Hellenistic justice, but here's where the story gets really twisted. The Greeks, who had spent centuries portraying themselves as civilized liberators freeing the world from Persian barbarism, quietly incorporated the most brutal aspects of Persian governance into their own systems. They kept the methods but changed the justifications, claiming they were using scientific approaches to criminal justice rather than divine punishment. This hypocrisy wasn't lost on their subjects. People who had hoped Alexander's conquest would bring more humane treatment discovered that their new rulers were just as creative with torture devices as their old ones. The only difference was that Greek executioners wrote philosophical treatises explaining why prolonged suffering was necessary for maintaining social order. The Romans took this intellectual dishonesty even further. When they absorbed the Greek successor kingdoms, they encountered detailed manuals describing various Persian execution methods. Roman legal scholars studied these documents not as historical curiosities, but as practical guides for dealing with their own political enemies. The boats made their way to Rome. Though Roman engineers improved the design with typically Roman efficiency, they developed standardized construction techniques, created training programs for executioners, and established bureaucratic procedures for determining which criminals deserved which punishments. They turned Persian artistry into Roman industry. Roman records indicate that Scaphism was used primarily against enemies of the state rather than common criminals. Senators who plotted against emperors, generals who showed too much independence, and provincial governors who got too comfortable in their positions all faced the possibility of the boats. The method had evolved from royal revenge to administrative tool. This industrialization of torture created new problems that the Persians had never faced. When Scaphism was rare and reserved for extraordinary crimes, it maintained its psychological impact through scarcity. But when Roman bureaucrats started using it as a routine punishment for political opposition, it lost its power to terrorize and began generating organized resistance instead. The Roman approach also created documentation problems that would have horrified Persian kings. Where the Persians had relied on oral tradition and carefully controlled rumors to spread fear, the Romans kept detailed written records of every execution. These documents eventually became evidence that their own subjects could use against them. Christian writers, in particular, seized on Roman execution records as proof of imperial cruelty and moral decay. They turned the boats into symbols of everything wrong with pagan civilization, using graphic descriptions of Scaphism to demonstrate why the empire needed spiritual transformation rather than administrative reform. The irony is delicious. The same documentation systems that made Roman governance so efficient also created the evidence that their opponents used to delegitimize the entire imperial project. Persian kings had understood that some forms of power work better when they remain mysterious and unpredictable, but the most significant change came when Constantine converted the empire to Christianity. Suddenly, rulers who claimed to follow the teachings of Jesus needed to explain why they were still using Persian torture methods on their political enemies. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, so here we are, staring into the abyss of human nature itself. The Persian Empire that gave us Scaphism wasn't some primitive barbaric wasteland, it was the pinnacle of ancient civilization, with gardens that inspired legends and administrative systems that modern governments still study. Yet these same sophisticated people turned human suffering into an art form, proving that our capacity for cruelty grows right alongside our capacity for beauty. The boats that held Mithridates didn't just kill one drunk soldier who couldn't keep his mouth shut. They became symbols of how power corrupts everything it touches, turning milk and honey into instruments of terror, transforming the tools of nurturing into weapons of destruction. And maybe that's the most terrifying lesson of all, that the line between civilization and barbarism isn't a wall, it's a choice we make every single day.